Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Faith Focus Weekly Discipleship Podcast. My name is Kevin Rognus, and I'm the Discipleship Director here at Faith Covenant Church. Thank you so much for watching or for listening today, and I just want to encourage you to subscribe and leave us a review to let us know how we're doing. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, my email address is listed in the episode description within the app or on the page that you're getting this from. So, right now, we have been in the midst of a 7-part series of episodes about church history, covering the entirety of church history for the last 2,000 years, which is a lot. We've been at a very high level. There's so much more depth that you can go into, of course. It's 2,000 years worth. Today is the final episode in that series. So we're going to be looking at roughly the last couple of centuries of history. And again, this is a very high-level summary. Please delve deeply into things if you want to know more. I've been taking all the content from this book and the book preceding it. This is called The Story of Christianity by Justo L. Gonzalez. And this book, this particular volume of this 2-part series, covers from the Reformation in the 1500s up to today, more or less. So, let's just dive right in. So, a lot of what scholars say about this kind of period of time of the church that we're currently in is that it's a transition into a time beyond Christendom, and I'll get into what that means in a moment. So what we're seeing a lot in these most 2 recent centuries, kind of around the world, is kind of similar themes. There's a lot of major movements that are coming from the lower classes. So you see things like the independence movement in the United States, or rather what became the United States, independence from the English crown, from the colonies, to becoming its own nation. Similar situation in France with the French Revolution in the late 1700s. You also saw independence of all the colonial nations in South America. They declared their independence from the crown, the Spanish crown, and became independent nations in the 18th century. So also the 1700s, and then into the 19th century, into the 1800s as well. Into the 19th and 20th centuries, so the 18 to 1900s, you see revolutions all over the world, in Mexico, Russia, China, Cuba, Kenya, literally all over the world. Revolutions were happening, so many of which we've studied. We're not going to go deep into those and what those mean. There's the Russian Revolution in 1917. So there's so many of these that we could cover, but we just can't do it all. So these couple of centuries, of course, were massive upheavals around the world. 2 world wars, continuing conflicts that we're dealing with ramifications of today. Major shifts in colonial powers. So, of course, Great Britain lost its North American colonies when the U.S. became an independent nation. However, in the same time frame, the Great Britain gained colonies that had previously been held by the French and the Dutch. So there's major shifts in colonial powers in this era. There's also a lot of European nations that sought to colonize Africa in the late 19th century. So the late 1800s, the European powers just kind of descended upon Africa and took over major parts of it, or most of it, depending on which country was kind of taking over. So we're still, of course, dealing with the ramifications of that today. Apartheid in South Africa just came to an end in the 1900s, and that was a lingering effect of the colonial era. There's lots of nations that are still dealing with the effects of colonial eras, not just in Africa, but around the world. Also, during all of this, again, there's so many things, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries, you get the Industrial Revolution. So suddenly things that had previously entailed tremendous amounts of manual labor became industrialized, became much more efficient to do, so you start seeing more mechanized farm labor that's much more efficient and can do a lot more things. With this mechanization of so many industries, of course, comes a lot of social upheaval, because suddenly you have large groups of people that can no longer be employed in the ways that they used to be employed. And we're dealing with similar situations today with the information revolution. So all of these seismic changes are happening around the world at a rapid pace, and Christianity and the church is just kind of trying to keep up with that. Sometimes the church was driving some of these things. Sometimes it was responding to some of these events. So Christianity by the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries had truly gone around the world. That's not to say that everybody is a Christian or has heard the gospel, but you can truly see that Christianity has reached into every country in the world at this point in church history. At the same time, this is the era that a lot of scholars are saying is a post-Christendom era, or we're starting to get into that. It's also sometimes described as a post-Constantinian era. So if we remember back to some of the earliest episodes of this series, the season where Emperor Constantine of the Byzantine Empire, when he first started accepting Christianity, that was the beginning of official state support of the Christian church. That's when Christianity became a dominant political and cultural force, and society was largely organized around Christianity. Now scholars are saying we're, after about 1700 years since Constantine, we're finally moving out of that era where Christianity is no longer, in many or most nations, no longer the dominant force of politics or culture. And scholars have very different feelings about that, Christian scholars in particular. Some lament this and say that we're straying from what we should be. Others are celebrating this and saying that Christianity, in getting so involved with political power, has become devalued in some ways or corrupted in some ways. And they would say that the church is now able to be the church itself without connection to political power. So there's a whole bunch of different ways that we can look at what it means for the church to be moving beyond an era of Christendom. So, with all that said, there were lots of movements going on, and we're going to delve a little bit deeper now into some of these things that have been happening in a more specific way. So in the United States in particular, at the very beginning of the United States, so late 1700s, just as the U.S. had kind of formed as an independent nation, you had two movements that were kind of emerging out of the Protestant Christian church at the time in the U.S. So the first of those movements was called Unitarianism. And in this view, which most Christians today and even at the time dismiss as not being truly Christian, but it's kind of a movement that came out of it. So in this view, Unitarianism, there is no Trinity. There's no idea of God as the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And there's very little theological orthodoxy or tradition. It's really an emphasis on human freedom and intellectual ability. So it's more this idea of God exists, but we have a lot of freedom to figure things out on our own, and we have the power to choose our destinies and kind of choose what we want to do. Another idea that developed out of the church, and I say out of in the sense that it was kind of a leaving of the church and leaving the bounds of Christian orthodoxy, was a movement called Universalism. And this is something that happens and is fairly common in secular circles, but it's the idea that in the end, all will be saved because God is love. So it's the idea, and sometimes there are Christian universalists that would say that if a person doesn't accept Christ during their lifetime, they will still be a part of the new creation because God's love will ultimately do for them what they could not do for themselves by accepting Christ as Savior. So those were two movements that were happening early on in United States history. Along the same time, Baptists and Methodists in particular experienced really strong denominational growth. So those were movements that had originated in Great Britain largely and really found strong roots here in the United States. So throughout the early eras of the United States as a nation, Baptist and Methodist roots got put down pretty deep and they became pretty significant denominations. Catholicism and Lutheranism were also growing significantly in the United States, largely due to immigration. Other movements also kind of immigrated to the United States, such as the Mennonites, Orthodox groups, Jewish groups as well. So a lot of religious growth in the early days of the United States was due to immigration. Now, some of those immigrants were very regionally located, so a lot of Catholic immigrants came to areas like Maryland, kind of in the central areas of the new nation. Others, such as like the Puritans and some of those groups, were mainly going towards the New England area, so the northeast of the United States, of what is now the United States. So many immigrants, including the first colonizers of the New World, as it was known at the time, later really kind of saw the New World, or later the United States, once it was declared as a nation, they really saw it as a promised land of sorts. They saw a whole bunch of new opportunity. They believed that there was just land out there for the taking, set to be developed and settled upon, even though there were already indigenous peoples living there. However, there was the perception that this is a promised land. We can go start our new thing. We can live our religion to its purest expression and go do that. And so that was very attractive to a lot of people on religious grounds. And that was a very important of our founding makeup as a nation. Of course, there were many people who were also immigrating for more economic or political reasons as well, so it wasn't solely a religious immigration. Later, as we got into the 19th century or the mid-1800s, there was a political doctrine that began called manifest destiny. And it was this idea that had religious undertones, that the United States was established by God as a Christian nation, and its destiny is to expand westward and keep on marching west from sea to shining sea, was kind of the idea. So there was a lot of religious overtones to that, but it also got very tricky because it was achieved through violence. Violence against indigenous peoples, violence against Mexico. At the time, Mexico had significant land holdings that stretched up into areas of Texas, California, kind of the American Southwest, up into that area. And essentially, manifest destiny was used as a pretext to go to war for an open land grab against Mexico. Ultimately, of course, we know that that did happen. The land was taken by the United States, but there were a lot of Christians that did not think this was a good idea. They think that it was just an open aggression, an open land grab, and they did not see that as compatible with the gospel. So you'll see kind of throughout, as we have seen, a lot of times there are Christians that are for something like this and Christians who are against it. Of course, slavery was also something that was a huge factor that was going on. Of course, slavery predates the foundation of the United States, but when the United States was founded, it did not abolish slavery immediately. And from the beginning, you had some Christians that were very much opposed to slavery. They were abolitionists, and they became the leaders of the abolitionist movement, particularly in the American North. There were also Christians that were trying to use the gospel and the Bible to support slavery and to continue the traditions of slavery. So again, like I said, Christianity was sometimes used both ways, and you could also say misused or abused, particularly in the cases of slavery. Now, the Quaker movement that we've talked about in a previous episode, they were they were at the forefront of some of the abolitionist movements, and they were really instrumental in helping that get started. Leading up to the Civil War, a lot of church denominations also split over slavery. So you had Methodist denominations that split up into a northern and southern denomination, one that did not support slavery and one that did. So the Civil War and the lead up to it was really a time of intense division for America, not just politically, but also in the church as well. after the Civil War happened and slavery was indeed abolished, segregation did continue even in the church. That wasn't universal throughout the country, but throughout many parts of it, there were many segregated congregations. This led to many black-led churches and denominations, some of which continue today. So some of the earliest churches, earliest black churches, historically black churches, had their roots during this immediate era after the Civil War. Now, of course, it's never good to see segregation in the church, in the kingdom of God. That's not the image that we are given of in Revelation of the renewed heavens and earth, when every nation and every knee will bow. However, this season right after the Civil War did lead to a number of new black churches and new black church leaders, which is very important. So that's something that was happening immediately after the Civil War. Also, kind of in this era in the United States, we see movements of holiness or Pentecostal movements that were gaining a lot of steam in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, so late 1800s and into the early 1900s. Also during this time, there was kind of wave after wave of new immigrants from Europe. Many immigrants were leaving Europe for various reasons. Sometimes it was famine, such as the Great Famine in Ireland in the 1800s. Also religious reasons. So different waves of immigrants were bringing various new ideas. Some of these new ideas from Europe were kind of classified as liberalism, and were some of the ideas that we kind of still see today as more not so much necessarily political liberalism, but more the academic liberalism, with the kind of ideas of humans can figure these things out. It's the It's the kind of humans as the apex of history, and humans figuring things out for their own, and putting ourselves at the center instead of putting God at the center. So a lot of those ideas were coming in, and some of those things were new. So ideas like evolution were coming in to the United States from other places. You also have ideas that are questioning the validity of the Bible. So a lot of European traditions that were developing at the time in universities were coming to be known as textual criticism, and they were starting to look at the nitty-gritty details of the text and see, is this conflicting? Did this person that we think wrote this book of the Bible really write it? Is it really valid? So a lot of these ideas are coming into the United States from outside of the United States. With that, we also see ideas that are maybe a return to some biblical ideas. So more social gospels are coming up that are reminding Christians that we need to be caring for the marginalized and the poor, feeding the hungry, caring for the sick. Things that were described by Jesus in particularly the Sermon on the Mount was really important to those kinds of movements. So in reaction, of course, because there's always a reaction to everything, is in reaction to some of the social gospel or liberalism ideas, you got some fundamentalist movements that were developing along the same lines. And so that was starting to really play out into the 1900s, and we're still seeing that play out today. We'll come back to that a little bit more at the end of the episode. One of the movements one of the theological movements that came out of that was this idea called dispensationalism. This was a particular and new idea from the 19th century, so it had its roots in the 1800s. And it's an idea that saw eschatology in a very particular way that's relatively new. It's the idea that's been popularized by the Left Behind books by Tim LaHaye and Jerry B. Jenkins, mostly in the late 90s into the 2000s. That particular theology stemmed from the 1800s. And so it was a relatively new idea that has become very popular, mainly in American Christianity. You don't see it as much taking root elsewhere in the world. Other movements that came out of Christianity are often viewed as separate. Were also developing in the United States at this time. So you get Mormonism developing in the early 1800s, and Jehovah's Witness movements in the 1800s, and also a movement called Christian Science in the 1800s. We're not going to get too deeply into that, but just know that they're kind of branches off from Christianity, and that's kind of when they were happening within the United States. So amidst all these changes happening in America, of course, massive changes are happening internationally as well. So as I mentioned, in France, there was a French Revolution not long after America declared its independence. And the French Revolution finally eventually disposed of the French monarchy. The French monarchy had recently, at that time, declared religious independence for anyone, Protestants and Catholics alike. But once the French Revolution came into place, the new French government said, we have no allegiance to the jurisdiction of the Pope. And so that was kind of really massive for a European nation at that time to say that the Pope has no jurisdiction, no legal political jurisdiction over us. So a really significant separation of church and state in Europe. America had already kind of done that. Great Britain had done that. But now a European continental nation in France has now officially declared that. A significant portion of the French Revolution's leadership wanted an age of science and reason to kind of overcome what they called like superstition and religion. They wanted to be really grounded in reality, or so they thought. So an age of science and reason was really coming to the fore and forming the basis of government. Later, after the French Revolution, Napoleon kind of tried to reinstitute some religious freedom. Not that he was a good person, but he was kind of reinstituting some of that after there had been some problems. So that was going on. 1848 was a big year in Europe. There was all kinds of conflict. We can't really go into it, but there were multiple revolutions and revolts throughout Europe. It was just a year of really intense upheaval. Basically, anytime there was one revolution in one place, it kind of inspired and empowered people to do it in other places. And so there was several revolutions that kind of were ignited in 1848 in places like Germany, Italy, Belgium, Great Britain, Switzerland, and France. So France, again, had another kind of situation. And so oftentimes it was kind of getting rid of the last kind of vestiges of a monarchy and getting a more secular, non-monarchy government put in place in many of these revolutions. In Great Britain, Christians were at the lead of a abolitionist movement that started in Britain much earlier than it got started in the United States. And by the early 1800s, Britain was taking steps to abolish the slave trade. So they kind of started off by abolishing the slave trade, and slaves that were already in place could be maintained as slaves. But it wasn't until some years later that they finally, throughout the British Empire, completely abolished slavery. So again, years before the United States did that. In 1870, a kingdom in Italy kind of was proclaimed. So prior to that, there had kind of been a bunch of little like mini nation states kind of throughout Italy, and Italy kind of finally unified in 1870 as a nation of Italy and took control of what had been called the Papal States. So the areas that the Pope had direct political governmental control over. So Italy unified. That was kind of a power struggle between the church and Italy, and that was a major turning point because then the church, which was based in Rome still, no longer had political or governmental control over Italy and over the lands that it ruled from. So at that point, that was kind of a transition to the Catholic Church being solely a religious institution instead of a religious institution that also had direct political or governmental power. So as all these things are changing in Europe, basically what we're seeing is a trend of separation of church and state increasing, and also national identity starting to be prioritized over religious identity. So people are maybe identifying first as German instead of first identifying as Lutheran or Protestant or Reformed. So also during this season in Latin America, things are happening. So nations started breaking away from Spain, like I said. So within rapid succession, a lot of nations in South America declared their independence from Spain. So Paraguay, Uruguay, Chile, and more. And they kind of worked from there and kind of eventually went around until pretty much all of the nations of Latin America had declared independence from Spain, and Brazil had declared independence from Portugal. So, and the Brazilian independence happened because of Napoleon, because Napoleon took over Portugal. So Portugal was no longer able to keep a hold on Brazil, so Brazil became independent at that point. Haiti, one of the islands in the Caribbean, or one of the nations in the Caribbean, gained independence from France during the French Revolution. They kind of saw that as their opportunity to split away. And so amidst all of this, these are areas that had been predominantly Catholic, not a lot of Protestants at this point because they'd been settled by or colonized by Catholic nations. Leadership of the Catholic Church in Latin America was severely interrupted because as some of these revolutions were happening, some of the high leadership, like the bishops of these nations, had been put in place by the Spanish royalty. Well, when the Spanish royalty was no longer in charge, a lot of those people had to go back to Spain. And so the church was refusing to recognize bishops or leaders that were from the Latin American countries. It was kind of a power grab. So for a long time, the sacramental life, so the administering of the sacraments in the Catholic Church, was severely interrupted because the church was refusing to recognize their independence for a very long time. Eventually that changed, and they did start to recognize leaders that were from these nations, often indigenous peoples or peoples that were among the lower classes, finally being recognized and kind of elevated to leadership positions within the Catholic Church there. So then that's happening in Latin America. Then let's look at kind of Eastern Christianity. So Eastern in the sense of like Eastern Europe, so like Russia, kind of down into Turkey, kind of that area of the world. Now, this area of the world had already been grappling with a post-Constantinian era for a long time, meaning that they had been dealing with what it means to be a Christian when Christianity is no longer the driving force of culture or government. Why is that the case? Well, in a previous episode, we talked about how the Byzantine Empire was ultimately defeated by the Ottoman Empire, which was a Muslim empire, and that happened in 1453. So Eastern Christianity in many parts of that area had been dealing with what it means to be a Christian in a post-Christian world since 1453. So for several hundred years now, they've had those resources. So when the Ottomans took over, for a long time, a lot of Christians, initially, a lot of Christians celebrated that because the Byzantine Empire had been kind of tyrannical and really not good. So a lot of Christians initially celebrated that as a liberation from the existing empire, even though it was theoretically a Christian empire, but practically that's not how it was unfolding. Initially, even though the Ottoman Empire that took over was a Muslim empire, a lot of Eastern Christians, Eastern Orthodox Christians, still had some freedom to be practicing religion. So it wasn't like stamped out. It was still a possibility. They were the minority, and there was oppression from time to time, but they still did have some of those resources. The Ottoman Empire did not reach quite so far north as to get into the lands now known as Russia. And so the Russian Orthodox Church was kind of able to split off and be its own thing separate from the rest of the Eastern Orthodox Church that was under the Ottoman Empire. So at the time, the Russian Orthodox Church really saw itself as kind of a defender of orthodoxy. Kind of, we are the ones who are holding tradition because the Eastern Orthodox Church is kind of under siege in some ways. So that was happening. They split off in 1453. So the Russian Orthodox Church has been its own thing now for over 600 years. Along the same time, the patriarchs of the churches, the Eastern Orthodox churches, which the patriarchs are kind of like the bishops in the Catholic Church, they had a lot of tolerance from the Ottoman Empire as long as they didn't oppose the leader's policies, so the Sultan's policies. So throughout that season, a lot of the Eastern Church was kind of looking at what was happening in the Western Church and Catholicism and Protestantism and kind of going, what's going on over there? And so a lot of the discussion in the Eastern Church was kind of a response to or a reaction to what was happening in the West. Later, as the Ottoman Empire began to dwindle in the 19th and 20th centuries, so the 1800s into the 1900s, a lot of the Eastern churches kind of split off into smaller national churches. So that's when you see the beginnings of like the Serbian Orthodox Church or the Bulgarian or the Romanian Orthodox Church. They each kind of formed their own national churches as soon as they were able to do so once Ottoman power was kind of fading away. Then in later years, and we'll touch on this again in a bit, but the USSR, the Soviet regime, kind of came in, and communism was in place over a lot of these Eastern Orthodox areas. And there was a lot of challenges and oppression with that. In a lot of cases, the Soviet Empire was severely restricting their ability to meet and to gather. In many cases, there was really heavy surveillance. So that was a problem, but they also were able to kind of have this quiet thriving that then was able to kind of really come out again once Soviet rule ended. So a really trying time, but they made it through, and that's been a really powerful witness to the church in Europe. One other interesting thing about the Eastern Church that I'll say for now is that a lot of these Eastern Orthodox churches have preserved a lot of liturgical tradition that a lot of people are returning to today. A lot of Protestants today are rediscovering some of these more traditional liturgical items and realizing that even though there's a lot of value to the developments of theology that Protestantism has offered, especially in moving away from the corruption in the church at that time in history, there's still a lot of depth and connection to the historic church that the Orthodox Church has preserved. And so that's been a really helpful development to see some of the Orthodox traditions coming into Protestantism and seeing people kind of re-experiencing some of those things. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the geographic expansion of Christianity, because we're truly seeing now a point in history as we get into the 18th and 19th centuries where Christianity has gone to every continent and every country. That's not to say that every person has heard the gospel, but we see that Christianity is really having a presence around the world. Now, sometimes that's a very challenging thing to talk about, because sometimes Christianity came in to various areas through colonization and practices that were extremely devastating and harmful for the indigenous peoples in those areas. So Christianity was sometimes used as a weapon. It was, people were subjugated in the name of Christianity and making them Christians and teaching them the gospel, but really that subjugation was a way of using them for labor, using their resources to develop wealth in other nations. So Christianity has a really fraught relationship in many places of the world because of the ways in which it was used improperly. Now, pretty much across the board, when there were ways that Christianity was weaponized, particularly against indigenous peoples, there were almost always people along with that were saying, no, this is not right. This is not the way that Christianity should be. So throughout history, the Christian church, there's always a tension of people misusing Christianity and people trying to rediscover and redeploy Christianity in a way that is true to the Bible. In the 19th century, the 1800s, you see the development of a lot of missionary societies. So these are something that are still around today in a variety of ways. YWAM is one such example that we have today. So these missionary societies were essentially parachurch, or organizations that exist outside of a formal church, parachurch organizations that were developed to send missionaries all over the world. And this was something really interesting about this was that women were getting very involved in the 1800s with this. A lot of women were separately as women saying, we want to support missions. And sometimes the missionaries they were supporting were men, but sometimes there were women as well. There were a lot of women going into mission fields and doing things in some cases that they could do at home teaching, caring for the sick, nursing, those kinds of like caring professions. But in some cases, women were also seeing more opportunities to exercise gifts in preaching that they couldn't necessarily exercise in their home countries. So that was a really interesting development in watching women get more involved in the mission field than had previously happened. A lot of missions work in the 1800s and into the 1900s was focusing on areas in Asia like India and China, Southeast Asia, etc., and also Africa as well. In Asia in particular, there were areas and seasons where it was very difficult. So in China in particular, in the early 1900s, there was the Boxer Rebellion, and that led to the deaths of thousands of Christians. Because China at the time was really trying to reject any sort of foreign influence. So lots of these mission fields, sometimes they were very successful. Other times it was something that put them at tremendous risk, but they took that risk anyway for the sake of sharing the gospel with more people. So that was happening, and like I had said earlier, talking about the Ottoman Empire, by the late 18th century and into the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was dwindling, and so particularly in northern Africa, European nations were coming in and kind of stepping into the areas that the Ottoman Empire had previously held power. And that kind of opened up the mission field into Africa. And so a lot of missionaries started coming into northern Africa and evangelizing there. We also saw the development of other areas of Africa, which there had been European colonies in previously, but some of the missionaries started leaving the colony areas and going deeper into Africa and working to evangelize to areas there. So that was all going on there. And then in Latin America, areas that were once predominantly very Catholic opened up a lot more to Protestantism once independence was declared in those nations. So lots of geographic movement of Christianity in the 1800s and into the 1900s. So some other developments that were going on, particularly in the 1900s, in Roman Catholicism, or Catholicism, based in Rome, so Roman Catholic Church, for kind of the first 6 decades, so the first 60-ish years of Catholicism in the 1900s, Catholicism was still kind of in a place of reacting to developments in Protestantism. They were trying to stay very traditional, trying to keep things the way things were, and just try to hold the line as much as possible and maintain worship in the way that it's been for hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years. And so at the same time, Catholicism was also losing, or by this point had lost, all of its direct political or governmental power. So in response to all of these shifts going on around the world, the Pope at the time called for a Second Vatican Council, so a major council in the 1960s, the early 1960s, and it took a couple years to kind of shake out, but it produced some really major changes for the Catholic Church. This council was crucial in part because it was the most diverse council of its kind. Instead of in the past, instead of being predominantly Western European church leaders, it was church leaders from around the globe. Western European church leaders were not even half of what this council was. So it was a truly global council of Roman Catholic leaders, and they produced a lot of changes. One of the major points of change was that after this council, the Catholic Church declared that it was acceptable and even good to have Mass or Catholic Church services in the language of the local areas. So in German, in English, in Spanish, in French, whatever the case was, instead of Latin. Up until that point, a lot of the liturgies of the Catholic Church were continually being led in Latin. So this was a major change, and that was a very good change for many people, that it made worship much more accessible. This council also declared more religious tolerance of other people, notably in that was tolerance towards Jews, because the Catholic Church was recognizing that there's been so much traditional prejudice against Jewish people, and that needs to stop. We need to stop intolerance of other peoples. So then, in the decades since then, the Catholic Church has been much more open to dialogue with the world. It's a very big change from pre-1960s back centuries Catholicism. So the Catholic Church today is much, much different in that it's much more open dialogue with the world and trying to understand what's happening in the world and that sort of thing. There's also in the Catholic Church in recent decades, of course, we've all heard about the major sex abuse scandals and its various cover-ups. So the church has been dealing with major internal challenges as well. With that has come reform. The Catholic Church has had to grapple with that and put in place better structures for accountability, and that work is ongoing. But there's also been a lot of growth in different areas with the Catholic Church. So it's been growing in lots of places. And kind of like I said earlier, with younger Protestants rediscovering the liturgies and traditions of Eastern Orthodoxy, a lot of younger people are also kind of returning to Catholicism, or at least looking at Catholic resources, particularly for things like celibacy. That's not something that the Protestant Church really developed a lot of, and the Catholic Church has a lot of resources that delve into celibacy and what that can look like. So there's a lot of ways that Catholicism is still experiencing a lot of vitality and a lot of really helpful things going on. So just a few more things happening. Protestants in Europe, in particular, faced a lot of challenges in the 20th century, particularly around World War II. So in the 1930s, during the Nazi regime, Hitler was able to kind of reach kind of a peace agreement of sorts with the Vatican, with the Catholic Church. That kind of, it's hard to say what it really did, but it kind of just basically said, you don't mess with us, we don't mess with you. And so they kind of came to that understanding. Along the same time, Hitler tried to unite the Protestant church in Germany, and he kind of did. He kind of created a special German Protestant church that was no longer Lutheran or Reformed. It was the German Protestant church. A lot of the Protestant church went along with that because a lot of what they were hearing they liked, because it had a lot of theology of we are being perfected. So the Hitler idea, the Nazi idea, was that, we are the perfected Uber race, and they kind of combined that with church Christian ideas of we are being perfected in our faith, kind of combined that, and unfortunately, a lot of the church went along with that. That's why we saw a lot of complacency from German Christians during the Nazi regime. Of course, that wasn't everybody. There were several churches that kind of combined together and said, this is not the true gospel of Jesus Christ. This is not right. They formed kind of their own church and became known as the Confessing Church. That was often a very big risk because they were very much at odds with the Nazi regime. And we all know that if you're at odds with the Nazi regime, there were major consequences for that, often death. One such example of that was a man named Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He was a pastor and a seminary professor in the Confessing Church. He stayed in Germany to great risk to himself into the late 30s and into the 1940s. He had been a pacifist for many, many years due to his Christian convictions. At the end, however, he kind of realized that essentially was him foisting choices on other people. And so he did get involved with some of the movements to try to assassinate Hitler to bring an end to the Nazi regime. Ultimately, he was discovered, arrested, thrown in prison, and while he was in prison for a couple of years, he earned the respect of a lot of people, including the prison guards, and he was really, really highly respected. He was ultimately killed by being hung just a few days before the prison that he was at was liberated by Allied forces. So he was a major figure within Christianity during that time and has become really influential. One of the books he wrote, The Cost of Discipleship, is a very influential book. It's a really excellent read. I strongly recommend it, and has been very influential for many Christians today. So after World War II in Europe, Christianity in Eastern Europe was oppressed under the Soviet regime, as I mentioned. There was a lot of dialogue from Christians that were still under communist rule. between like Marxist ideas and Christianity and what's compatible here and what's not. So there was some of that dialogue with some of the theological developments going on. After the Cold War ended and after communism fell, a lot of missions work started. There was a lot of Protestant missions that immediately started trying to go into Eastern Europe. Again, the Eastern Orthodox Church was already there and doing the best that they could, despite the challenges they were facing. But then there was an influx of Protestant missions going in as soon as the wall fell. In contrast to that, in Western Europe, where communism was not in place, the church wasn't really thriving there either because the church was just becoming very secular. So by the end of the Cold War, mainly, I think I read like something like 10% of the population in Western Europe was identifying as Christians. So you see a diminished Christian presence in both Eastern and Western Europe for two very different reasons, which is really interesting. So today, Europe is increasingly secular. The numbers of people identifying as Christians is dwindling. But that's not to say that there isn't mission work going on. That's not to say there aren't thriving, vital churches. So there's a lot of really potent, powerful stuff going on in Europe. It just doesn't look like what it used to. So today, a lot of scholars would say that Europe is firmly in the post-Christendom era in which Christianity is no longer the driving political or cultural force. Now, people in Europe certainly have plenty of freedom to be Christians. That's not to say that they're being oppressed. It's just to say that it's no longer the driving force of culture or government. So, coming back home to the United States, after World War II in particular, the suburbs, of course, exploded in growth, and so the church in the suburbs really grew tremendously as well. And a lot of denominations kind of just abandoned the inner city churches and kind of let the inner city kind of go into decay. A lot of rural churches were also abandoned. So a lot of churches really focused their resources on the suburbs and suburban churches, which certainly was somewhat necessary on some levels to, have churches where the people are moving to. But they often did it at the expense of abandoning areas that were kind of previously where churches had been. There was also a lot of communist hysteria that was going on in the post-war area during the Cold War in particular. And a lot of the communist hysteria took on really religious overtones. Like, communism is directly opposed to Christianity, so we need to stamp out communism. We can't have any sort of communism here in America. That led to, on some levels, some political disenfranchisement of certain people with communist leanings. So, problems there. So you're, again, kind of weaponizing Christianity to fight something else. Not to say that communism was so great. Communism itself can be in conflict with Christianity as well, but yeah, things can get complicated. Another major religious development in the post-war era in the United States was the civil rights era. This was something that was led by Christians in many cases, not all, but many. Many Christian pastors were leaders in the civil rights movement, most notably Martin Luther King Jr., but other pastors as well, pastors that were both white or black. So that was a movement that had a lot of Christians and Christian theology kind of underpinning the movement itself. Other movements were also happening, like the moral majority in the 1970s and 1980s, and that really began a very strong connection between certain parts of Christianity and the political right. So that's something that, of course, is still very much in force today, and people have disagreeing views on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but that's kind of when it got its roots, was kind of in the 1970s and 1980s. However, overall, Christianity does seem to be dwindling in the United States, similar to what's been happening for decades now in Western Europe. So in 1900, 96% of Americans identified as Christians. By 2005, that number was down to 83%, and depending on who you ask today, that number is much lower, like lower than 50% today. So a a lot of scholars would say that the United States is moving into a post-Christian era, where Christians have freedom of religion and have the right to be Christians and exercise their faith, but Christianity is no longer the dominant driving force of politics and governance or of culture. Depending on who you ask, we're already there or are going there, and there's a spectrum to that. So today, getting to where we're at, just kind of in a wide snapshot level for the church, most of church growth is not happening in the United States or in Europe. It's mostly happening in places like Latin America, Africa, and Asia. Those are currently the areas where you see the most growth of Christian churches and people declaring themselves to be Christians. So that's just something that's good for us to know in America, to know where God is on the move. That's not to say that God's not also on the move here in the United States and other places as well, but it's just good for us to know what's happening in the church as a whole. So I want to come back to one of the themes that we've been talking about. A lot of scholars would say that we're moving into a post-Christian or post-Christendom era, or not dumb as stupid, D-O-M, Christendom, or post-Constantinian, aka when the church and the state kind of became developed. A lot of scholars agree that we're moving in that direction, but there's a lot of disagreement over what that means for the church. Some people argue that this is the worst thing ever for the church because it means fewer Christians, it means potentially a return of severe persecution of Christians. Not to say that persecution never left. There's certainly nations where people are being martyred for their faith. But a lot of people disagree on whether the overall movement towards post-Christendom is a bad thing. So people say it's bad for those reasons. Some people would say it's good because some people would say this frees us from the temptations of power, from the temptations of using power improperly. Some would say that it's a return towards the original early church because the original early church was also not in political power or the dominant force in culture. So there is a huge spectrum on what this means for Christian faith and the Christian church today. Certainly we don't know how that's going to play out, and there's no easy answers to any of those questions. But these are the things that we need to be aware of. We need to understand where what has influenced and created the situations that we're in today so that we can best respond moving forward into the future. That is a whole lot of stuff to cover in just 7 episodes of church history. So roughly 2,000 years worth of things. So thank you so much for joining this journey. I certainly did not answer every question or go into every detail of everything that happened. That's just not possible. So yes, please feel free to ask questions. Please feel free to dig deeper. There's so much to talk about, and I just hope that this creates more conversation for you, for your family, and for friends. So if you have any questions, again, my email address is listed in the episode description. Thank you so much for coming on this journey with me. Thank you. Please subscribe, leave a review, let us know how we're doing. Thank you, and have a wonderful and blessed day.